In her entire preoccupation with Mr. Rassendyll, she gave little thought to what might have happened at the hunting lodge, but Bernenstein drew gloomy auguries from the failure of Sapt and myself to return at the proper time. Either evil had befallen us, or the letter had reached the king before we arrived at the lodge. The probabilities seemed to him to be confined to these alternatives. Yet when he spoke in this strain to the queen, he could get from her nothing except, "If we can find Mr. Rassendyll, he will tell us what to do." Thus, then, a little after 9 in the morning, the queen's carriage drove up to my door. The ladies of the Chancellor's family had enjoyed a very short night's rest, for their heads came bobbing out of the window the moment the wheels were heard. Many people were about now, and the crown on the panels attracted the usual small crowd of loiterers. Bernenstein sprang out and gave his hand to the queen. With a hasty slight bow to the onlookers, she hastened up the 2 or 3 steps of the porch, and with her own hand rang the bell. Inside, the carriage had just been observed. My wife's waiting maid ran hastily to her mistress. Helga was lying on her bed. She rose at once, and after a few moments of necessary preparations, or such preparations as seem to ladies necessary, however great the need of haste may be, hurried downstairs to receive her Majesty and to warn her Majesty. She was too late. The door was already open. The butler and the footman had both run to it and thrown it open for the queen. As Helga reached the foot of the stairs, her Majesty was just entering the room where Rudolf was, the servants attending her, and Bernenstein standing behind, his helmet in his hand. Rudolf and the Chancellor had been continuing their conversation. To avoid the observation of passers-by, for the interior of the room is easy to see from the street, the blind had been drawn down, and the room was in deep shadow. They had heard the wheels, but neither of them dreamt that the visitor could be the queen. It was an utter surprise to them when, without their orders, the door was suddenly flung open. The Chancellor, slow of movement, and not, if I may say it, over quick of brain, sat in his corner for half a minute or more before he rose to his feet. On the other hand, Rudolf Rassendyll was the best part of the way across the room in an instant. Helga was at the door now, and she thrust her head round young Bernenstein's broad shoulders. Thus she saw what happened. The queen, forgetting the servant and not observing Helsing, seeming indeed to stay for nothing and to think of nothing but to have her thoughts and her heart filled with the sight of the man she loved and the knowledge of his safety, met him as he ran towards her, and before Helga or Bernenstein or Rudolf himself could stay her or conceive what she was about to do, caught both his hands in hers with an intense grasp, crying, "Rudolf, you're safe! Thank God! Oh, thank God!" And she carried his hands to her lips and kissed them passionately. A moment of absolute silence followed, dictated in the servants by decorum, in the Chancellor by consideration, in Helga and Bernenstein by utter consternation. Rudolf himself also was silent, but whether from bewilderment or an emotion answering to hers, I know not. Either it might well be. The stillness struck her. She looked up in his eyes, she looked round the room, and saw Helsing, now bowing profoundly from the corner. She turned her head with a sudden frightened jerk and glanced at my motionless deferential servants. Then it came upon her what she had done. She gave a quick gasp for breath, and her face, always pale, went white as marble. Her features set in a strange stiffness, and suddenly she reeled where she stood and fell forward. Only Rudolf's hand bore her up. Thus, for a moment, too short to reckon, they stood. Then he, a smile of great love and pity coming on his lips, drew her to him, and passing his arm around her waist, thus supported her. Then, smiling still, he looked down on her, and said in a low tone, yet distinct enough for all to hear, "All is well, dearest." My wife gripped Bernenstein's arm, and he turned to find her pale faced too, with quivering lips and shining eyes. But the eyes had a message, and an urgent one for him. He read it. He knew that it bade him second what Rudolf Rassendyll had done. He came forward and approached Rudolf. Then he fell on one knee and kissed Rudolf's left hand that was extended to him. "I am very glad to see you, Lieutenant von Bernenstein," said Rudolf Rassendyll. For a moment the thing was done, ruin averted and safety secured. Everything had been at stake. That there was such a man as Rudolf Rassendyll might have been disclosed. That he had once filled the king's throne was a high secret which they were prepared to trust to Helsing under stress of necessity. But there remained something which must be hidden at all costs, and which the queen's passionate exclamation had threatened to expose. There was a Rudolf Rassendyll, and he had been king, but more than all this, the queen loved him, and he the queen. That could be told to none, not even to Helsing, for Helsing, though he would not gossip in the town, would yet hold himself bound to carry the matter to the king. So Rudolf chose to take any future difficulties rather than that present and certain disaster. Sooner than entail it on her he loved, he claimed for himself the place of her husband and the name of the king. And she, clutching at the only chance that her act left, was content to have it so. It may be that for an instant her weary, tortured brain found sweet rest in the dim dream that it was so. For she let her head lie there on his breast, and her eyes closed, her face looking very peaceful, and a soft little sigh escaping in pleasure from her lips. But every moment bore its peril and exacted its effort. Rudolf led the queen to a couch, and then briefly charged the servants not to speak of his presence for a few hours. As they had no doubt perceived, said he, from the queen's agitation, important business was on foot. It demanded his presence in Strelsau, but required also that his presence should not be known. A short time would free them from the obligation which he now asked of their loyalty. When they had withdrawn, bowing obedience, he turned to Helsing, pressed his hand warmly, reiterated his quest for silence, and said that he would summon the Chancellor to his presence again later in the day, either where he was or at the palace. Then he bade all withdraw, and leave him alone for a little with the queen. He was obeyed, but Helsing had hardly left the house when Rudolf called Bernenstein back, and with him my wife. Helga hastened to the queen, who was still sorely agitated. Rudolf drew Bernenstein aside and exchanged with him all their news. Mr. Rassendyll was much disturbed at finding that no tidings had come from Colonel Sapt and myself, but his apprehension was greatly increased on learning the untoward accident by which the king himself had been at the lodge the night before. Indeed, he was utterly in the dark. Where the king was, where Rupert, where we were, he did not know. And he was here in Strelsau, known as the king to half a dozen people or more, protected only by their promises, liable at any moment to be exposed by the coming of the king himself, or even by a message from him. Yet, in face of all perplexities, perhaps even the more because of the darkness in which he was enveloped, Rudolf held firm to his purpose. There were two things that seemed plain. If Rupert had escaped the trap and was still alive with the letter on him, Rupert must be found. Here was the first task. That accomplished, there remained for Rudolf himself nothing save to disappear as quietly and secretly as he had come, trusting that his presence could be concealed from the man whose name he had usurped. Nay, if need were, the king must be told that Rudolf Rassendyll had played a trick on the Chancellor, and having enjoyed his pleasure was gone again. Everything could, in the last resort, be told, save that which touched the queen's honour. At this moment the message which I dispatched from the station at Hofbau reached my house. There was a knock at the door. Bernenstein opened it and took the telegram, which was addressed to my wife. I had written all that I dared to trust to such a means of communication, and here it is. I am coming to Strelsau. The king will not leave the lodge today. The count came, but left before we arrived. I do not know whether he has gone to Strelsau. He gave no news to the king." "Then they didn't get him," cried Bernenstein in deep disappointment. "No, but he gave no news to the king," said Rudolf triumphantly. They were all standing now round the queen, who sat on the couch. She seemed very faint and weary, but at peace. It was enough for her that Rudolf fought and planned for her. "And see this," Rudolf went on. "The king will not leave the lodge today. Thank God, then we have today." "Yes, but where's Rupert?" "We shall know in an hour if he's in Strelsau." And Mr. Rassendyll looked as though it would please him well to find Rupert in Strelsau. "Yes, I must seek him. I shall stand at nothing to find him. If I can only get to him as the king, Then I'll be the king.